The history of Yves Saint Laurent is actually the history of 20th century fashion. Everybody's collections are influenced by Saint Laurent. Everybody's collection is, in effect, a product of Saint Laurent's legacy. When you look at Yves Saint Laurent's clothes, there's that sense of juxtaposing very traditional French ideas with something that's a little bit more raw.
He had a great talent for having his finger on the pulse of what young, fashionable, wealthy women wanted to wear.
He was always looking at everything through French eyes and through Parisian eyes. I think there's something incredibly Parisian about his point of view. And people talk about him as a rebel, but he was a very sort of bourgeoisie rebel. Female sexuality and male sexuality, and really exploring those through high fashion, through haute couture, was something quite exceptional to do at that time.
Yves-Henri Donat Mathieu Saint Laurent. He was born in 1936 in Oran, in Algeria, to a very comfortable middle-class family. But again, like so many male designers of that era, he was doted on by his maman.
His mother was incredibly well-dressed. He talked a lot about the clothes that she used to wear for parties in the 1930s and 1940s. They had an incredible influence on his aesthetic growing up. And he was undoubtedly her favourite son. She indulged him, she indulged his every whim. And so he was allowed to experiment with art.
He was always very delicate, and he was not a jock, I think we can safely say. He was an effeminate little boy.
And as a child, Saint Laurent would make paper theatres, he'd make paper dolls, he would dress them, act out theatrical productions with his siblings. He was very artistic very early on.
At the age of 18, Yves Saint Laurent submits 3 sketches to a fashion competition.
He entered a competition run by the International Wool Secretariat.
One of his designs came third, and another came first in the dress category, which at that point in time was considered the most important category of all to win. The amazing thing was that fellow winner was Karl Lagerfeld, who won first prize in the coat category.
A chance meeting with Vogue editor Michel de Brunoff proved very fruitful for Saint Laurent, because de Brunoff then introduced this very young man, Saint Laurent, to Christian Dior.
What that actually enabled Saint Laurent to do was to begin an apprenticeship with a French haute couture house. Karl Lagerfeld went to work with Pierre Balmain, and Yves Saint Laurent went to work with Christian Dior.
Christian Dior was rather struck by Saint Laurent, and he looked at his sketches, and there was a sort of certain similarity in their approach and their aesthetic. So Christian Dior offered Saint Laurent a job in his house, which was extraordinary because Saint Laurent was so young at the time.
And when he starts at Christian Dior through the recommendation of a sort of friend, he isn't designing. He is not designing clothes. He is helping tidy up the interior of the couture house and decorate the interior of the couture house. And only gradually does he begin to actually contribute sketches and contribute designs.
I think he spent the first year quite menially designing some of the accessories, and I think that's interesting also that that was considered quite a menial task in those days. Of course, accessories now are so important to a house, and they far outsell the clothes. It would be considered an extremely senior position.
What was significant with Yves Saint Laurent is very quickly he was able to sort of absorb the Dior style, but also to start to create his own signature. So I think from very early on, once he was involved in the design process, he was making designs which look so much like a Dior, but have a sort of Yves Saint Laurent element to them.
Dior became more and more appreciative of his talent. Saint Laurent was given greater and greater control, and indeed, the final collection, presented in 1957, was considered to have been designed almost entirely by Saint Laurent.
Saint Laurent makes his mark in an iconic fashion shoot.
So the dress in Richard Avedon's picture of Dovima, a very famous model, between the 2 elephants, I mean, and a wonderful, very enduring image of that time, probably one of the most famous fashion photographs ever. That's a Dior dress, but it's a Saint Laurent Dior dress.
The dress that Dovima wears in the famous Richard Avedon portrait of her with the elephants in New York Zoo really indicates the kind of style that Saint Laurent was introducing to Dior. It was a more contemporary feel. It was something less constructed, something more youthful, and something softer. Saint Laurent himself wasn't credited for that design, obviously. There's a lightness to it, which stands apart from the heavier work that Dior began his career with.
In 1957, Christian Dior suffers a fatal heart attack.
When Dior died in 1957, Saint Laurent became the head of what at that point was an enormous business.
So it's quite a shocker for a young designer who hasn't been working there very long, who doesn't have a sort of deep background in fashion, to take over.
At one point, Dior took Saint Laurent's mother to one side and informed her that Saint Laurent would be the named successor if he ever passed away. People have questioned if Dior should have closed when Monsieur Dior died. I don't think that was an option at all. By the end of 1949, the house of Christian Dior accounted for 75% of France's fashion export and 5% of France's overall export.
What happens is you then start to see Yves Saint Laurent growing in confidence, which is good for Christian Dior's house, but it also means that he's starting to pull away, in a sense, and design more towards his own interests and aesthetics, which causes problems then within the couture house and within Christian Dior.
After he was appointed head designer, Saint Laurent went back to Algeria and designed his trapeze collection. He then returned to Paris with a suitcase full of sketches, laid them out, and worked with the heads of the atelier and with Dior's right-hand woman, Mitza Bricard, to edit them down into a collection. That collection was known as the Trapeze.
A dress that was made of quite sort of heavy fabric, so it had quite a weight and a pull to it. It hung from the shoulders and was like a pyramid coming out from the shoulders, if you like. And the early versions of it were in a sort of deep grey, almost like a men's suiting fabric. So it was carrying on elements from Dior, who also played with men's suiting fabrics, but in a very sort of youthful rendition in the trapeze line, which was putting emphasis on sort of long, skinny legs.
The whole ethos of the collection was youthful. It was unfitted. It was a move away, distinctly away from Dior's new look. It suited Dior's clients. It wasn't anything. It was youthful, but not too young. The headline that has kind of been immortalised from that debut is that Yves Saint Laurent has saved France.
He had a great ear for the tone of what was going on the streets, and he had his finger on the pulse. Sometimes that isn't always allied with great design, but he married both, which was probably one of the secrets of his immense success.
Yves Saint Laurent was inspired by the beatniks on the French left bank, who, to contemporaries, were hooligans. They were called blouson noir, which stood for black jacket, and Yves Saint Laurent did his black jacket in crocodile lined in mink.
This beat collection that was very much inspired by his muse stroke friend Betty Catrou, who's everything you want a French woman to be. Sort of tall, languid, thin, very blonde, smoked a lot, high cheekbones, and whatever she wore, she looked amazing.
But it was still seen as this kind of rebellious translation of subcultural style into high fashion. He was dressing his clients in the clothes of the people that were going to mug them. And I think that when you think about it in that way, you can understand why it scared Dior executives to death.
This beat collection was obviously black, lots of trousers, sort of slightly flared, leather coats, polo necks. It was just incredibly chic.
The really interesting thing I find is that apparently the beat collection was incredibly successful commercially because it was lots of black clothes that people looked very elegant in.
Everything you want it to be as well. Well, everything we'd want it to be now, although the establishment was a little bit taken aback by it.
I think because it was so tainted with this rebellion and with the idea of Saint Laurent being a live wire, that it was kind of the final straw for Dior executives.
At this time, the War of Independence was raging in Algeria.
Aged 24, relatively late, Saint Laurent got drafted into the French army in Algeria.
There was a clause that if Dior insisted that Saint Laurent's presence at Dior was important, that they could block him from being drafted. If he was too essential to the industry, then he wouldn't be drafted into the army. And the reason they allowed Saint Laurent to be drafted into that army was because he presented the Beat collection.
It was extraordinary that that should happen because he was so unsuited to military life. He only lasted 20 days, but it was, the effects of that were sort of catastrophic.
He was invalided out, sent to a military hospital called Valgrasse, and was heavily drugged. It was the start of a dependency on narcotics that continued for the rest of his life.
In a not entirely supportive move, the House of Dior fired Saint Laurent once they heard of his breakdown and his sort of his release from the army. I mean, you'd think that having a breakdown would be bad enough, but then he lost his job as well.
Pierre Berger was really instrumental in getting Saint Laurent out of the military hospital. He went to visit him every day. He talked about founding the Saint Laurent Fashion House.
And he then sued the House of Dior, and he won.
By suing Dior, they obtained the seed money to actually found the house of Yves Saint Laurent.
And this means he's really free to explore his own influences, his own generation, and sort of free from the Dior legacy.
Saint Laurent was not an easy man by any stretch. And, you know, the two had this incredibly interconnected relationship. They were lovers, they were business partners, they were frenemies. They were so enmeshed in one another. Even when they stopped being lovers, Saint Laurent was wildly unfaithful. There was always this incredible sort of love between them.
Saint Laurent's first collection was quite sober, but really throughout the 60s, his designs have actually come to kind of epitomise the decade. You can look at very emblematic designs like the Mondrian dresses, which were ripped off endlessly at every single level. Possibly one of the first examples of a dress trickling down so quickly from designer to mass market. At the end of the war, the new look was really about taking women out of trousers, putting them back into these enormous dresses, and these enormous dresses, these enormous skirts that were really indicative of what a woman's role should be. It's very, very old-fashioned ideas tied in with the new look.
I think the influence of menswear and of masculinity is there throughout, most iconically in the smoking, which is the male tuxedo translated onto a woman's body.
He could have been alluding back to Marlene Dietrich with the smoking, because she was really the first woman to be acknowledged for wearing trouser suits. I mean, she wore them in a very alluring way.
Society women had worn trousers since the 1920s and 30s, and they became popular during the war for women undertaking manual labour, but they were never really approved of by high fashion. And really, Saint Laurent putting a woman in a trouser suit is giving completely different messages.
We're getting towards 1968 and storming the barricades, and what did a woman need? She needed her pantsuit.
This idea that a woman can be sexually liberated, that a woman could go out and have her own career, that a woman didn't need to rely on these old ideas of femininity to look feminine.
Another really important element is his interest in art, both as a collector and as a designer, and the way that informs his use of colour and fabric is very significant. And then I would say the third element is looking at Paris as a city and looking at what women are actually wearing on the street and thinking how his work relates to that and how he can translate that particularly into his Rive Gauche designs.
Saint Laurent has been widely tributed with being the first designer to do ready-to-wear, although actually Givenchy had done it earlier. But he is definitely the first designer to have a separate shop for his ready-to-wear line, which was called Rive Gauche, which means left bank in French. Left bank being the sort of the in those days, the trendy part of town, the opposite of the right bank, which was very, very bourgeois. The left bank was where all the artists and the writers hung out.
It was an area which connected with the beat movement, which connected with the sort of existentialist movement. So looking at kind of ensembles completely made up of black separates, of pea coats, of little hoods, leather jackets. So this combination of what people are wearing on the street, but the kind of haute version of that, the most luxurious, most well-tailored version.
His first customer in the Rive Gauche boutique was Catherine Deneuve, and it was incredibly commercially successful. And really what that line did was to kick all the other French couturiers and make them realise that ready-to-wear was going to be the future. Really, it's the first time that you see a designer running ready-to-wear and haute couture lines side by side with distinct identities that both add to the expression of the house.
Saint Laurent was a great champion of multi-ethnicity way before that became a sort of a buzzword. A great designer needs the right women wearing their clothes, and Saint Laurent had a lot. Number one, actually, is probably Catherine Deneuve, who wore him really early on, most notably in the Belle de Jour, which couldn't have been a better subject for Saint Laurent, because it's about a very respectable middle-class Parisian woman who has fantasies about being a prostitute, but always looks absolutely impeccable. Butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. And this sort of subversiveness beneath the respectability, beneath the impeccable look, was absolutely music to Saint Laurent's ears.
Yves Saint Laurent diversifies into perfume.
So very quickly, he starts to develop a number of different perfumes that are expressive of different collections, of different facets of his design house.
Rive Gauche, when that perfume came out, was probably the centre of the universe. It was the place to be. Forget New York, certainly forget London. It was Rive Gauche in Paris, left bank, with the intelligentsia and the great clothes. What's not to like? Lots of handsome French actors, beautiful French women in miniskirts, and Saint Laurent.
Saint Laurent himself was an idealised version of that late 60s, early 70s man. Saint Laurent himself posed for his Pour Homme advertising campaign. He originally wanted to pose with the rather phallic perfume bottle between his thighs, but the photographer Jean-Luc Cf persuaded him otherwise, that a simple nude portrait would be much more tasteful.
He was naked. It's not the normal marketing route. Later on, of course, he did Opium, which was considered quite shocking to name a perfume after a drug.
Opium was an incredibly significant launch, first of all because it cost an enormous amount of money. They hired a Chinese junk and moored it in a harbour in New York as the launch party, but also because Yves Saint Laurent's winter 1977 haute couture collection was entirely inspired by Chinese fashion. And in effect, it was the first time an haute couture collection had been designed in tandem with the release of a fragrance.
YSL has become an international sensation with boutiques the world over.
In the late 70s and early 80s, Saint Laurent had moved away from that kind of rebellion and from that idea of revolutionising and changing fashion.
Because by then, couture was becoming, for all designers, a very expensive thing to do. It wasn't really a profitable enterprise. It was all about ready-to-wear and perfumes.
And what I think you sadly see as he ages is him becoming increasingly dependent, increasingly weak, and sadly unable to take part in the sort of very rigorous, very demanding life of a couturier.
With Saint Laurent, there were those highs and there were those crashes, and there were these kind of extreme indulgences physically and also extreme indulgences creatively.
The drink and the drugs, who knows how it started, whether it was something that came about because he was given a lot of medication after his breakdown. And also he had a very, very fragile state of mind at the best of times.
it becomes clear that Yves Saint Laurent is no longer sort of able to run the house or to design for the house. It's bought by a conglomerate, and a series of designers take on the role of guiding the design aesthetic.
In 2002, Yves Saint Laurent retired from Haute Couture. He'd been designing Haute Couture solely for 3 years, and he bowed out with an enormous retrospective collection that ran through his greatest hits. The finale was 100 black tuxedos, worn by different luminaries, including Laetitia Casta, Catherine Deneuve, all these iconic women wearing iconic garments by Yves Saint Laurent.
Yves Saint Laurent dies in 2008. Faithful to the end, Catherine Deneuve attends his funeral wearing the black trench coat she wore in Belle de Jour.
François-Henri appointed 4 years ago Hedi Slimane as the new creative director at Saint Laurent.
Hedi Slimane changing it to SLP rather than YSL was inevitably going to cause a backlash, because Yves Saint Laurent is such a beloved figure within fashion and still has such resonance even now within the younger generation. But I think it will be interesting to see how it pans out in the long term, because if Slimane can consolidate his own look for Yves Saint Laurent, he can change it into SLP. And I think we're yet to see if he can do that. Can he sustain a style that crosses over and becomes his own style, his own aesthetic, but within the bracket of Yves Saint Laurent?
I would moot that the difference is that Saint Laurent was original, whereas Hedi sort of, he excavates those archives, absolutely, and then pretty much reproduces them faithfully. But hey, it is selling. Young women really want that brand again. Commercially, it's a huge, huge success.
For Saint Laurent, it was about recreating the mood of a time and recreating something from his personal memory. There's something incredibly personal about what Saint Laurent did. And maybe that's why it's so difficult for someone to kind of recapture that magic, because it's so much about his personality, his personal demons even. It's about him tackling his personal life. It's about him really trying to express emotion around his own work. Yves Saint Laurent invented the style of the 20th century.